Hello everybody and welcome to week 6 of the course. Today we're going to be talking about Paul and also 1st and 2nd Thessalonians and Galatians. I hope you all enjoyed your reading for this week, or whenever you do read, I hope you enjoy it. I did my dissertation on Paul, so I know quite a bit more about him than I do the Gospels, but I'm really excited about these next 3 weeks, and I'm not going to be super hard on you on Paul. I just am really excited about it. This is the one lecture I'm going to give where I don't follow Metzger. I left my Metzger book at home. I'm on a trip right now, so I also left all my notes at the house. We were kind of in a hurry to get out because my father-in-law was ill, and we made it just in time for my wife to hold his hand whenever he passed. So I'm busy helping the family with all kinds of arrangements, but I found a few hours to spend on this. I didn't want to slow anything down this week, so here I am. And it's going to maybe be a shorter lecture, but hopefully interesting. I wanted to say on this third point here, everybody should love Paul. Don't be afraid of him. Whenever I grew up, our creed was, in the Baptist church, no creed but the Bible. I don't know how many times I saw a preacher hold up a Bible in his hand and tell us how wonderful it was, and that it's the Baptists' only creed. In other words, it's what we believe, our confession. In other churches, they say no creed but Christ, and they only read the Gospels. This was a shock to me when I started teaching seminary. There were students, actually 90% of the students I had at a Disciples of Christ school had not ever read the New Testament in total. They had only read the Gospels, because their creed was no creed but Christ. So most of these people were afraid of Paul because they'd only heard bad things about him. Now, Paul did write his letters in a different time for a different group of people. A lot of people think that Jesus taught simply, and he taught us to love everybody and turn the other cheek, and Paul exploited the gospel for his own purposes. But the thing is, the epistles of Paul come historically first. Paul came first and then the Gospels, and the church accepted both in most places. Now, some churches, like the Marcionite Gnostics, they accepted Paul as the original Gospels, and they only accepted the undisputed Gospels. We'll get back to that here in a minute. But they first received Christianity from Paul, and they didn't accept the Gospels, except for Luke, which is an affirmation of Paul. So it's very telling that a very large group of Christians accepted the earliest Pauline letters and one of the earliest Gospels, and then rejected everything else. They rejected the letters that we know today are not written by Paul, the pastorals. That's 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. And also, he rejected some of the other disputed epistles, like Ephesians and Colossians. So that solidified it for me whenever I found out that it was the order in which they received them, that those letters were not Pauline. But anyway, let's get into it. This second bold, I'm going to keep what I'm talking about up here at the top of the screen, and you can kind of see what's coming up next. These are just the lecture notes. I didn't have time to create a PowerPoint presentation or anything like that, and some of you might like this format better, but if you do, please let me know and cite feedback. Who is Paul? Now that is a mystery. We do have several of his writings, He does say some stuff about himself, but like Plato and some other writers who write about themselves, everything just about that he wrote about himself is subject to interpretation. None of it is plain, and almost all of it can contradict itself in one way or another. So scholars are going to be sorting this out for quite some time. I have to pause it for a second. Okay, we're back. I like traveling in time. What was 5 minutes to me was 1 second to you guys. But okay, who is Paul? This is something I was saying a minute ago that scholars are going to be debating exactly who Paul was. Like, exactly what did Paul believe? Was he a citizen of Rome, or was he a citizen of Tarsus, or both? Was he rich, or was he poor? We just don't have the definitive answer in the epistles of Paul, and even in early Christian tradition. The people who were closest to Paul, actually, they disagreed on exactly who he was. Now, we know that he is from Tarsus. He told us that. I mean, that's pretty plain. It was a wealthy city. It had a lot of Roman citizens, and Luke seems to think that Paul is a citizen of Rome, but the problem is he is treated like he's not a citizen of Rome by the authorities. So, that's one problem. And another problem is Paul only says that he was a citizen of the great city of Tarsus. Now, you can be the citizen of the Roman Empire, or you could be the citizen of a city, and it is mostly purchased, like you do some service to the city, and you earn your citizenship, and then it's passed on from father to son. And I can't remember. And you can be a female citizen as well. If you were a slave and you were freed, you could not be a citizen, but your children could be citizens if you were able to purchase it for them. So it was a complex process, and you were normally well off if you were able to get citizenship, which is why some people think that Paul was wealthy, and his father was a tent maker, probably, or merchant, who purchased citizenship for him, and this would explain why Paul was able to travel so much in the ancient world, if he had a little access to a little bit of money. But the thing is, you didn't have to be wealthy to travel in the ancient world. It was dangerous for everybody, but a lot of poor people could find out when a wealthier person was leaving town and simply travel as part of a caravan with the wealthier person, and maybe even do a service to them, protect them from bandits who would try to rob these people. It was just something that was it was dangerous, and people usually didn't travel unless they absolutely had to. They didn't go to Dallas to go to Six Flags just for fun most of the time. Sometimes they did go on vacations, but most people liked to stay home where it was nice and where at least they were relatively safe. I don't think, on the second point here, he was probably not a citizen of Rome because I don't think that a lot of things would have happened to him, and also he only identifies himself as a citizen of Tarsus, and being a citizen is something to be proud of. If you're a citizen of Rome, probably going to mention that at least once in the letters, and he definitely had occasion to. Particularly whenever he was being persecuted, and the church was being persecuted in Thessalonica. But there's a significant snag in the Paul is poor argument, and that is there's evidence of wealth in the Pauline epistles, the most important of which is Paul appears to have a full Greek education. And by full education, I mean that he went to grammar. It looks like he went to grammar school, and then he received some kind of education in rhetoric. And rhetoric is the art of Greek speech and persuasion. His letters can be. Oh, well, I'm going to get into more into rhetoric in a few minutes. And then, having all of this education, he was probably poor because he worked for a living. He was a tent maker. It's interesting that being a tent maker, you only need a finite number of tools, and you can carry them on your back if you're traveling. So he had a profession that allowed him to travel and to set up shop relatively easily wherever he went, because people needed the stuff that he produced, and it was used all over the empire. So, and part of tent making would be linens and the use of leathers. So he probably worked with all of those things in order to make a living. And you can make a decent living as a tent maker, but nowhere near the amount of money that you would need to both be a Roman citizen and get the education that he received. Education was only almost exclusively the privilege of the wealthy. But like today, teachers are usually, if not living in poverty, they're not the most well-paid people in the world. So you wouldn't say your teachers today, and certainly not Dr. Barnes, your teachers are not wealthy, but we can teach our children. And that's what happened in the ancient world, and that's a major part of my dissertation, is showing how poor people had access to education through their parents, if their parents were teachers. But other than that, the poor people, which made up about 99%, up to 99% of a given population, were poor and uneducated, which leads us to an irony that we talked about earlier about the church being written, the church writing all of these letters to poor people who could not read the letters. But there usually would be at least one or two people in the congregation who could read the letter to everybody, and after that, everyone memorized it. So there are some contradictory and ironic paradoxes about Paul that hinder us from nailing down exactly who he is. If you are going to grow up and be a New Testament scholar, you're going to have to decide, because all of these things affect how you interpret the epistles of Paul. You'd have a very different meaning if he's a wealthy person financing his own missionary journeys and having this education and rhetoric. If you explain, he has an education and he has experience in the art of Greek persuasion, which is rhetoric. Now, how did he get it? Did he get it because he's wealthy, or did he get it as a poor person who was very fortunate to hang out in the forums maybe and listen to lawyers and other educated people debate things? So, I mean, there are avenues, but we also have to deal with what usually happened in the ancient world. So, it is very, very tough, and you're going to have to think through all this. But for this course, all you need to know is that there are some things that point to Paul being wealthy, and there are some things that point to Paul being poor. And you have the reasons for that. Another thing is about the wealthy and working for a living. The wealthy Romans looked down on and even despised people who had to work for a living. If you were a wealthy person and a part of society, you had your land that other people worked for you, and you spent your time in the baths, getting clean and fornicating, and in the brothels, while your subordinates would be out working your land and getting you money. Not that much different from what's going on today. in my opinion. Okay, who was Paul? You all know that Paul was a Pharisee. He claimed to be one, and this helps us to know him a little bit because you had to be at least, I believe, you had to be at least 30 years old in order to be a Pharisee, and you also had to be married. So we know with a high degree of certainty that Paul was married, but he never mentions a wife. And some people have thought that the wife was the thorn in his side. Paul talks about a thorn in his side, but he does not mention what it was. I think that's a little bit harsh, but and it looks like from the instructions that Paul gives regarding marriage, it looks like he has absolutely not one romantic bone in his body, and he is not being influenced by a woman at all. It's very male-oriented, and even in this society, whenever you read other first-century writers who write about marriage and family, they do have a male-oriented persuasion, but they do recognize a little bit more the purposes and the wonderful nature of being in love, or the husband and wife getting along in the world and conquering everything. He doesn't fit in that literature. He fits in the philosophical literature of household management. When the philosophers write about how one should govern the household, Paul follows exactly in their footsteps, and it's very generic. He doesn't really focus on what actually works in human relationships. And that's very important to realize, that he might have been married, but obviously it did not work out for him in one way or another. He persecuted the church, as you know from Acts. He almost admits to this in his epistles, but he doesn't quite go over the edge on that. And then he repented, and he enthusiastically gave of himself to the church. He's the kind of guy who just goes the extra mile when he's committed to something. Whenever he was committed to the Pharisees, he persecuted the church. When he's committed to the church, he went all over the known world preaching the gospel, and just gave 110%, went to the extreme. And he is the only person that did that, only apostle who traveled that extensively in the ancient world and had that passion to unite Judaism and Gentiles. Now, who is Paul? Third point. He never met Jesus. One of the requirements to be an apostle is you have to have met Jesus. But Paul says he's like a baby who was born out of due time. He was actually stillborn, but God saved him and made him an apostle. Now, some people think, well, he saw Jesus on the road to Damascus. Well, it's sort of true, but to be an apostle, you had to actually see Jesus in action, whenever he was living and working the miracles and preaching. Paul did not hear any of that, but he says that he spent a little bit of time in Jerusalem and got to know the apostles, especially James and John and Peter. He learned from them, and then he learned from God. He spent 14 years or so between the time of his calling and the time of his first mission, learning and meditating on God and meditating on the Old Testament. And because of that, he developed amazing theologies. Whenever he was comparing those two ideas and wrestling with it for so many years, he is the one who basically formed Christianity as we know it. Jesus really lived the life of a great teacher, and he taught some very basic things. but there would be no Christianity without Paul. The teachings of Christ are not systematic theologies. You can't really get a theology that's strong enough to support entire religion off of um, these few teachings. But with Paul, he creates, justification by faith, and the other pillars of the Christian religion that we know so well. Um, Paul also founded most of the churches in the ancient world that we know about, the earliest ones. He did not found the church in Rome, that was Peter, but, Ephesus, Corinth, Miletus, um, Colossae. I mean, he just goes on and on and on. He just founded his church and moved on. And he had a very specific method that I didn't talk about, at least in the notes, where he would go into a town and preach in the synagogue and try to gain a wealthy person, a wealthy patron who could support the church and find a house that they could meet in, and then give them the gospel, and then he would move on and write epistles to them with further instructions. Sometimes he would stay for a few weeks, sometimes he would stay for years in a place, and then he was extremely passionate about getting the gospel out to as many people as he could, whereas the apostles only founded maybe one church, if they did found a church. Their mission was in Judea, and then after they got finished in Judea, they did branch out a little bit, but they did nothing like what the Apostle Paul did. He's a missionary apostle. Talked about that. He wrote most of the New Testament. New Testament is 26 letters, and Paul is responsible for 13. So it's exactly half, but some of them might not be Paul's own hand, but you could say most of the New Testament is attributed to him, and he gives us most, like I said, Christian theology. Okay, you need to know these two terms when we talk about the epistles of Paul. There are disputed epistles and there are undisputed epistles. Like we said, there are 13 letters attributed to him. Some of them are disputed, which means they are probably not written by Paul. We get the word disputed by disputes between scholars on, some people think that Paul wrote it and some people think that Paul did not write a specific letter. And then there are some undisputed or genuine letters that all scholars think are written by Paul. There's no question in our minds that these letters belong together. Now, how do we know if something is written or not written by Paul? Well, we use the Holy Trinity. I'm going to skip down here. You can see my mouse. The Holy Trinity tells us what is Pauline and what is not, or at least what is Pauline. The Holy Trinity is Galatians, 1 Corinthians, and Romans. They are three letters that are undisputably written by Paul. And we use the vocabulary, style, and theology of these three letters to determine what the other letter, if the other letters are actually Pauline. Do they fit into this Trinity? Can we for example, we can't put Ephesians and Colossians in with the Holy Trinity because they don't fit in vocabulary, style, and theology. Okay, I had to pause it because I was getting interrupted in there, so now I'm in a closed area. Gotta love laptops, you just take them anywhere. So we were talking about what makes a disputed or undisputed letter. And what seals the deal on these arguments between scholars is the establishment of a vocabulary, a rhetoric, which is the style of argument, and theology, which of course is thinking about God, and then church structure. And we know, like, when we look at the original Pauline letters, we know that Paul has a certain church structure in the, there's a continuous church structure in Galatia, Corinth, and Rome. And whenever we look at the pastoral letters, for example, 1st, 2nd Timothy, and Titus have a completely different idea of church structure, and they claim to be written by Paul. And they also have a completely different theological approach and vocabulary. So scholars for a long time have known that these 3 epistles were not written by Paul. And I remember I took a class on. I was a teaching assistant in a class, and a nun was teaching, and she said, "There's not a snowball's chance in hell that the pastoral letters were written by Paul." And she was quite a character. One time we saw her dance on top of a table, but anyway, that's a story for another day, I guess. I embarrassed myself a lot with her, so she's a great scholar, though. Okay, so that's the disputed and undisputed terminology, and we will use that terminology later on in the lecture. Okay, the epistles of Paul pretty much split down the middle in their nature. One of them is the epistolary nature, which is nature like a letter, and the other one is ancient rhetoric, which is the ancient style of arguments. Now, there are many different types of argument or types of speeches, and a few ancient scholars like Pseudo-Libanius and Cicero and Aristotle, a few other writers wrote essays on how to criticize or interpret different types of speeches. So, whenever scholars read Paul, they can break up all of these letters into these different parts of speech or parts of a speech. And if it's in the introduction, it has one role. If it's in the body, it has another role. And we know what types of logic they used and types of digressions and examples, and every part of Paul's epistles can be interpreted in light of ancient speeches. And like I said, a few of the ancients wrote handbooks on how to interpret speeches. So a scholar can take the handbook, and the handbook and the Epistle of Paul and match them together and find out how Paul is using his arguments. And that will help us to understand what Paul is trying to say and help us to emphasize what he was trying to emphasize, and then also disregard things in Paul that are not important in the speech. They're just asides and not really what he's trying to say. Now, there's a very significant problem you need to remember with this, because people get way out of control. There's a guy named Bruce Witherington who has written 6 or 7 commentaries on the epistles of Paul, and he only interprets them through the speech or the speech types. There's a forensic speech type, which is used in courts. There is a persuasive speech type, which is also used in court, but it's not according to laws, but it appeals to the ethos or emotion. There are other types of speech that I can't remember off the top of my head, but you get the picture. The problem is these handbooks do not tell us how to interpret epistles. And a lot of scholars completely ignore this, and it gets them in trouble because the epistle is not a speech. So scholars like me are writing books and articles about how we should interpret it as a letter and as a speech, not one or the other, because Paul is probably I mean, they've proven that Paul is using different parts of speech. However, because it's a writing, it's a letter, it follows ancient epistolary theory, which is point number 2. Looks like I got these two, this epistle and speech. Hang on, I'm going to copy this. It's so important, it needs to be changed now. Okay, so ancient rhetoric, like I said, it follows different types of persuasion, and it has traditional parts of speech, but it's also an epistle, so it follows ancient epistolary theory. Now, just like ancient speeches, there are also people who wrote handbooks on how to write letters, and these handbooks on letters are far inferior to the handbooks on, or the writings on, speeches. The only thing that the ancient epistles do is tell you what type of epistle a person is writing when they write an epistle, and also parts of it. So there's a salutation, like Paul says, Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to the Corinthians. And then there's the body, and then there's the salutation at the end of the letter. The important thing about this is the epistolary theorists, they actually wrote samples of a thank you letter, like we see in Philippians chapter 4. And they also have a letter of consolidation, which is a letter of comfort, which is like 1 Thessalonians. They have a letter of friendship, and it just goes on and on and on. And they only wrote like a 3 or 4 sentence letter to show you what it looks like. And the problem is, with Paul, he is talking to a community that is facing a number of problems. And so whenever he writes his epistle, it fits into 4, 5, or 10 different ancient letter types. And that makes it very hard to interpret it just on epistolary theory. So what we do, whenever you're someone like me writing a book on Paul, I interpret the epistle of Paul as an epistle when it acts as an epistle, and as ancient rhetoric when it acts like ancient rhetoric. You can't fit the square peg in a round hole. Paul is doing something unique. He is writing letters to people, trying to establish a community and establish an identity, and then create a theology. He's doing a lot of things in these letters, and so it doesn't really fit into one or the other. And you also need to know this term, letter partition theory. Now, what that means, partition, means a split. And this is messy. If you're ever in a doctoral class, don't choose to write a paper on 1st or 2nd Corinthians, because it's a mess. I for my first course in my PhD studies, I volunteered enthusiastically to write a paper within 2 weeks about 2nd Corinthians, and it was absolutely horrible. Now, we know Corinthians by 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and there was a scholar, his name is Walter Schmithals, who figured out, he argued that there are not 2 epistles to the Corinthians in the Bible. There are 13. So he divides up little different verse sections, sometimes not even together. Like he'll say 1 Corinthians 8, 13, and 14 is part of a letter with 2 Corinthians 2, 15 through 18. I mean, it is absolutely nuts. And they are out of order. So, we can't interpret 1 Corinthians as coming first, and then 2 Corinthians. We have to interpret all these little sections that he chopped up based on vocabulary and argument and content, and also theories on interpolations, which is a little bitty section of text, like maybe a sentence between two other sentences that you can remove and it makes better sense. That means that somebody interpolated or put in a little portion of the text. So he cleaned all that stuff up, he thought, and he rearranged it all. And because of that, we're going to see a lot of different dates on the epistles of Paul, because he had to have written it at different times. Now, I already talked to you about the Holy Trinity. Now, the genuine writings of Paul, you absolutely have to know this because it tells us who Paul is and what his theology was. They are 1 Thessalonians, 1 and 2 Corinthians, Galatians, Romans, Philemon, Philippians. I tried to put this in order. As I was researching the lecture for today, I noticed that it's not easy dating all of these letters because of the partition theories and also the theories on the chronology of Paul. It's impossible, everybody, it's impossible to develop an absolute chronology of Paul, which means we don't know where he was each year of his ministry. Now, traditionally, whenever I was growing up through religion courses, I always saw a definite chronology of Christ. Earl Ellis, who is a scholar out at Southwestern Theological Seminary, and others, they developed an absolute chronology. Like, we know exactly where he was in fall of 54 and spring of 55. I mean, it is just absolutely 100%. This is when he wrote 1 Thessalonians and 2nd and all the other epistles. And if you just even look on Wikipedia on the epistles, scholars don't agree on any of them. So it's very, very confusing. And I just want you to know about when his letters were written, which is between 50 and 66 or 69. Let's just say 69, 50. And then exactly when, we don't know. So I just wanted to tell you some basic theological or characteristics of these epistles. In 1 Thessalonians, now remember, this is his earliest writing, in my opinion, and in the opinion of my teachers. Hang on. Okay, now, 1 Thessalonians is his first epistle, so it's the earliest part of his ministry, and I believe that Paul made some very serious mistakes whenever he was preaching in Thessalonica, and therefore the church was persecuted. And he has a hallmark here that we'll see in 1 Corinthians, in the Holy Trinity, the emphasis on faith, hope, and love. This is in both 1 Corinthians and in 2 Corinthians. I mean, 1 Thessalonians and 2 Thessalonians is faith, hope, and love. And I said Corinthians by mistake because you know about faith, hope, and love in 1 Corinthians 13, which is one of the most famous chapters in the Bible, probably second to Psalm 23. And then in 1 Corinthians is very, very, very different. Paul has favor with Jews and Gentiles in this city, and a few of them were wealthy. And we know that because of the meals that we have in 1 Corinthians. They correspond to wealthy meals that are described in other ancient literature. There are legal problems, and the law was only for the wealthy. There was an issue about the mother-in-law, and I argue in my dissertation that the mother-in-law was wealthy, and that was the cause of the legal problems in the church, and then you have church as a body, and that it follows an ancient teaching that the poor should serve the wealthy. And I bet if you probably never thought of that, and I mean I never did till I started reading more ancient literature. What happened was there was an army coming in to uh, destroy a city, and one of the wealthy council members got up and gave a speech about how the poor people should defend the wealthy because the poor people were going to be fine. The wealthy were the ones that were going to suffer the most whenever the invading army came through. Well, the poor people said, "We're not going to fight for you." And the city councilman gave a speech about how they are all one body, and the hand can't say to the other hand, "You're useless." And we're all in this together, so you need to fight for us. We're doing our job as the head, and you do your job as the body, and we can all get along together. And the poor people were hooray, hooray, convinced, and got rallied up and fought the invading army. So that is exactly how it's used every time it's used in ancient literature. And whenever Paul uses it, he probably uses it the same way. We need to, whether you're rich or poor, we need to be getting along. And the poor people are the ones that get the short end of that stick because they end up doing all the work. Now, that's why we think that the Corinthian church was probably wealthy. Now, not everybody agrees with that, but I don't think they have a very good argument. Anyway, 2 Corinthians is a god-awful mess. This if we just had 1 Corinthians, we wouldn't have a problem with 2 Corinthians, because it's with 2 Corinthians that you have a lot of interpretive problems. When was Paul in Corinth? What did he teach in Corinth? It's very jumbled and confusing if you read 2 Corinthians, if you're a German scholar, and you have a very very strict mindset on what a person can write. The only way you can make sense of it is to break it up and to look at it in a different order. So, really, the bad interpretation of 2 Corinthians leads to a bad interpretation of 1 Corinthians. I mean, there's just no other way to put it. The chronology or order of things, it really gets messed up if you start messing with the order of the material. I mean, that should make sense. In Galatians, there was a problem with eating with the Gentiles. You remember that Peter refused to eat with the Gentiles, who would only eat with the Jews, and Paul called him on his hypocrisy and said, "You're living like a Gentile." That is, you're not living the Jewish lifestyle anymore. You're living like a Gentile, so you might as well eat with them. And there was a problem in Acts about this very same issue. Jews and Gentiles trying to get along. The Jews refused to go into the homes of the Gentiles to feed widows, and vice versa, because of the issue of cleanliness and kosher. So this is something that had to be overcome everywhere Paul went. Philemon is a prison epistle, which means it was written probably from Rome whenever he was in prison. And the genre of prison epistles is very beautiful in Paul, because prisons were absolutely horrible. You do not want to be there. If someone wrote an epistle from prison, it was in the ancient world, it was just despair and get me out of here, please. I mean, it is a hopeless situation. Usually, you go to prison to die. It's not a place where you are held, and you did not serve sentences in ancient prisons. You went there to await your fate before the judge, or you just went there to starve to death or get dehydrated and die. So it was a very perilous situation. And whenever Paul writes his epistles from prison, he is the only person in the ancient world who's joyful and wanting to encourage other people. That's very special in our Christian religion. There's not a whole lot that we can hold on to as original and unique. And this one thing from Paul is something that separates him from everybody else. The disputed letters are 2 Thessalonians, Ephesians, and Colossians. And like we said earlier, disputed means that scholars disagree. Now, we disagree pretty much right down the middle as to the authorship of 2 Thessalonians, Ephesians, and Colossians. Now, I don't think Paul wrote any of these, but it really crushed me whenever Ephesians was not Pauline. But the vocabulary and theology just isn't there. Unless Paul, walked into some kind of other dimension and came back believing something entirely different from what he believed elsewhere, we would not have. He could not have written these epistles. But obviously, half the scholars that study the New Testament disagree. But those half are too conservative to quit. They can't. They can't religiously, because of their religious beliefs, admit that Paul did not write those letters. But the pastoral letters, like I said earlier, the nun said there's not a snowball's chance in hell that the pastoral letters were written by Paul. Now, the reason for that primarily is church structure. The structure of the church in Timothy and Titus are so different from all the others that it really is impossible that Paul wrote these letters. And most scholars have come to terms with that, and it happened, 300 years ago. So there are some pastors that still believe Paul wrote these 3 letters. I had a discussion on the way to Fort Worth the other day with my grandfather, and he believes everybody that he hears preach thinks that Paul wrote these letters, and there's probably not a difference, in church life. Our Bible is still holy, no matter who wrote it, but to say it was written by Paul is a fairy tale. The church structure in the pastorals is established, which means that it's at a later time. It's not in a state of development. It's in a state of finality. And Paul is, the writer of these epistles is trying to reinforce a tradition and not something that is new. So it's just it's something that is pretty much set in stone as far as scholarship goes. Now, if you don't want to believe that Paul didn't write those, it's not going to make any difference at all in what we do with the New Testament. It's still an early Christian document, and we have to deal with it. And there are some things in those epistles that, especially about women, that are very difficult, and we need to deal with them and not dismiss them if we believe that they're not Pauline. So, I believe, and so do other people, that they have authority, but they're just not the same thing as the other, not close enough to the other letters to be Pauline. Okay, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, as we said earlier, they are the earliest Pauline letters. Now, this is very cool because we get to get a glimpse of Paul at his earliest stage and be able to compare that with his later thinking, like in Romans. If you read 1 Thessalonians from a non-biased, with a clear mind, and then go read Romans, you will see that Paul has extremely developed theology in Romans and a different missionary strategy in Romans. than he does in 1 Thessalonians. Now, this is extremely critical that you get this. Whenever Paul went to Thessalonica, we know from his letters to the Thessalonians that he really screwed things up as far as making things easy for the church. His initial preaching was with something called frank speech. Frank speech is corrective speech. It's harsh. You're telling someone that they have faults and telling them how to correct their faults. And you can remember this as mother-in-law speech. This is what your mother-in-law does. She tries to give you advice that you don't want, and tries to thinks that she can identify problems in your life and tries to get you to correct them without knowing all the particulars. At least in your opinion, she could be right. But the frankness that she comes at you with can be extremely offensive. Now, frank speech is only to be done within the context of friendship. If my best friend tells me something that needs to be told, he sees a fault in me, he knows how to be frank and how to be kind at the same time. That's the context that you need to have in order to have corrective speech. It has to come from a friend. But Paul was out there criticizing people and criticizing wealthy people without establishing any kind of friendship. And so this caused the church great suffering. Some people did convert, but most of the people were put off by Paul, probably because he was criticizing idol worship pretty sharply, and he made enemies of both Jews and Gentiles, and basically disturbed the peace there. So but most of the persecution came from Jews. Whenever Paul's preaching the gospel and doing it wrong, and made the Jews very upset and made it hard for the church. And another thing that he did not do, we look down here at the poor and defenseless. He left the church poor, and he left the church defenseless. So that's why the church suffered persecution. They had no wealthy person to shield them from people that would want to do them harm. And the reason they didn't have a wealthy person there is because Paul screwed up. And he preached a little bit too frankly, and it bit him in the backside. And it bit him hard because he lost people. This is against the situation that we see in Acts with Jason. Paul won Jason over, who was a wealthy person in Acts, and then Jason got in a lot of trouble for it in town. But in the epistles, there is no evidence at all that they have anyone that can protect them from people that want to do them harm. And why would they want to do them harm? Well, in the ancient world, the family followed the religion of the paterfamilias, or the head male of the family. So if you and everything revolved around religion in the ancient world. I mean, it's just part of breathing. Like we even have in scholarship, we try to think, well, is something public or is something private? And then is something religious or something secular? Well, there's no such thing as private life in the ancient world. Everything's public or visible to outsiders. And then everything is religious. You go to the marketplace and buy meat, it's been sacrificed to an idol. All of the festivals that are in town are dedicated to a god. The Olympics and whatever games you have are dedicated to a god. And if you're a Christian and like Paul, you believe that all these idols are demons or all these idols are evil, you got a real problem because you can't participate in anything in the city. So it hurts friendships. Friends held everything in common. And if you accept a religion that separates you from your friends, uh, you no longer have the protection of your friends whenever it comes to persecution. And if you believed in Jesus and you're a part of a family, um, that whose family, the head of the family obviously worships a different religion, you don't have the freedom to choose a different religion. But maybe you're out on the street, you hear Paul preach, think it's great. Your new family is the church because you're not welcome anymore in the household. And the household is where you got your food, your protection. It's where you had your livelihood. Uh, the shops were attached to their homes. Even if you're wealthy, that was your place of business. It's something that you needed, you had to have to survive in the ancient world. And if there was no head of the church, head of the household of the church, the members of that household, the new family, is in serious trouble. So they had a separation between patrons and friends. Now, a patron is a wealthy person who gave, um, basically acted as a father figure to their clients. And let's say we're in the ancient world, and a class of PhD students is our clients, and they do services for the head professor, who is the patron, and the patron gives them protection. And by that, I do not mean something like the mafia. I mean the patron helps find them jobs, gives them credit in their books for writing, which helps the careers of the students. Um, she will even provide protection if somebody criticizes us harshly. She is a very powerful scholar, so she can call those people up and tell them what for. And in the ancient world, you got everything from your patron. Legal protection, money, food, everything. And every morning, the clients would line up outside of the house of the wealthy person and go in and basically worship them for a minute and get what they needed. And then maybe they'll provide a service in return, or praise was considered a commodity. So they would have to follow these patrons around town and worship them wherever they went, and tell them how great they were in front of other people. And that was a commodity, it's just like exchanging money. And the patron would support a ton of clients because the separation between rich and poor was dramatic. And that's how the ancient city worked. You had a few wealthy people who controlled everything, and a class of clients who were able to get stuff from the patrons, and that's why you didn't have civil unrest all the time. It did happen occasionally, but if the patrons knew what they were doing, they dished out just a little bit of their wealth every day and kept everybody happy. So it's something that held together the ancient cities in the Roman Empire. And then you even had patron cities, like Rome was a patron city of Corinth. So there was trade on a large scale between the two cities, and Rome elevated Corinth up to a colony status. Everybody had status in ancient Rome, including cities, and the Corinthians had certain obligations to the Romans. So it even comes down to when Paul wrote his letter to Rome, there is a very significant connection between Rome and Corinth in that letter. So that's that. And then you also have, as I mentioned, they can't participate in civil life because they can't have anything to do with idols or false gods. Okay, the theology of Thessalonians. Just a second. I wanted to tell you, I thought that I had another slide in here. What I think happened in Thessalonica is that Paul, uh, he screwed up. He didn't know what he was doing. It was his first. It was his first. Uh, one of the first churches he founded. Certainly, probably the first one that um, he preached. He preached in, established a church. He was really excited. He was new at the game, and he made a lot of people mad. The church still got established, but it was very, very rough for them. We do not see that in Galatia. We do not see that in Corinth. We do not see that in Rome. What we do see in those cities are meals, public meals that are provided by a patron, to do it like this. Public meals. We have legal things in Corinth. We have patrons mentioned, like actual supporters, and we have all these things point to a very big difference between what Paul did in Corinth and what Paul did in Rome, and the outcomes were completely different. Churches were much stronger. They weren't persecuted. In Thessalonica and the Thessalonian correspondence, the people were probably living in a completely different situation. They didn't have meals in their homes because they couldn't. None of their homes were big enough. They were living in little tenement housing, which is kind of like a huge, for lack of a better term, it's like an apartment complex. And they were meeting in instead of meeting in a home where you could have meals, they were meeting in like an atrium, inside the tenement house, or maybe a workshop. And so there's no indication of wealth in Thessalonica where there is elsewhere. And it's the only one where Paul says he preached that frankly. Okay, next two slides and we're done. The theology of Thessalonians. For one thing, there's a parousia, and this always comes up whenever the church is persecuted. Paul tries to convince them that Jesus is coming back soon. Parousia is the return of Jesus. And in this letter, it's immediate. Their persecutors will be defeated, and there is a mention of the immediate nature of the parousia in every chapter of Thessalonians. There's also a concept of election, another comfort to people who are being persecuted. God chose you for this purpose, and He is going to bring His purpose to completion soon. That's very comforting words in times of hardship. There's an emphasis on faith, hope, and love. When I took a class on 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, I took it with a guest professor from SMU, Victor Paul Furnish, who just finished a very well-received commentary on the Thessalonian literature. And hearing him talk about the role of faith, hope, and love really changed my life on how to view 1st Thessalonians. And it connects it, I think, more to Pauline theology than any other thing in this document. And you have the resurrection of the dead. Some people in the church have died, and we get in Thessalonians the idea that the dead will rise first, and then we'll meet them in the air, and so on and so forth. This is supposed to be immediate, and comfort that the dead Christians will not miss out on anything. Paul's concept of justification by faith is undeveloped. It is in first and 2nd Thessalonians. It's just not as developed as in Romans, and we'll talk to that point whenever we talk more on Thessalonians. And then Galatians. It's the second earliest letter, and this letter is precious to me because of what happens in Galatians 2 whenever Paul corrects Peter. Now this, make no mistake, folks, this is Paul establishing his apostleship. He is building up the authority that he has. He is correcting the most important person in Christianity. Even at this time, Peter was very, very well known. And Paul says in Galatians that he even went to Jerusalem and spent some time with the apostles and discussed with them what was the truth of the gospel, and they approved of him. So he is claiming apostolic authority, which is something he did at the beginning of the letter, but he's establishing it with an argument. And also in Galatians 2, you have his version of what happened at the Jerusalem Council, and it's different from Acts. We have to, if we're interpreting Galatians 2, we have to interpret its relationship with Acts, which is usually whatever Paul says, it has more authority than Acts, because Paul is a first-hand witness and is earlier than Acts. So there might have been a question of eating together, or a question of Paul's apostleship, which is why he needed to establish it. But he does so in a very polite and gentle way. In 2nd Corinthians, he is establishing himself as an apostle, as one who takes it for granted. He's like, I can't believe you're not accepting, you don't accept me as an apostle, and you're from Satan, and all this stuff. But in Galatians, it's quite different. He does say, you foolish Galatians, but it's much, much gentler than what he does elsewhere. Okay, God and family, we've talked about that with the other Gospels, with 1st and 2nd Thessalonians and persecution. Whenever you accepted a new religion, especially one like Christianity, like you can probably go from Demeter to Jupiter, okay, and still worship Demeter and just focus on Jupiter a little bit more than your dad. But whenever you're forsaking all ancient Roman religion and getting something new, it would be bad enough to go to Judaism, which is old, but to go to something new like Christianity, it is it just unsettles things. And then for other reasons, you separate from your family because you can't eat meat sacrificed to idols, and think idols are evil, so you can't do anything in the city. Excuse me. Okay, you have a lot of familial language. God's a father, we are brothers and sisters, and so on and so forth. Paul has to establish a new Christian family and a very strong, bear each other's burdens, love one another, meet together often. All these things that these people need who may have been kicked out of their families, and they have to even live together because they can't live at home anymore unless their father accepted Christianity, and they are very lucky. And then you have the living in freedom. You're forgiven, and you now live in freedom from the law. So that is the lecture. Hope you learned something. I might add some more on this lecture whenever I get back to Metzger. I'll just attach it to next week. It's not going to be that long. I just want to make sure I cover everything. Thank you all for your condolences. It's been a very, very difficult couple of weeks, and now it's climaxed with the passing of my father-in-law. So anyway, I am posting, of course you're watching this video, I'm posting a video, and thanks for taking, if you haven't taken the midterm, don't be worried about it, just do your best, and we will all get through this victoriously. So anyway, thanks everybody.